Kenya is a country located in the East Africa, and we're going to focus on the current economic affairs, challenges, or the future prospects of Kenya. The Kenyan economy is based on sectors mainly like agriculture, as it is a major producer of crops like tea, corn, wheat, or vegetables in Africa. Tourism is also a major contributor to the Kenyan economy, where tourists attract to the country's cultural attractions and diverse landscapes, ranging from beaches to wildlife. Kenya currently has a well-developed and secure financial sector with several banks, insurance companies, and other institutions operating progressively. Moreover, Kenya has a well-developed telecommunications sector as well as the construction industry, which has helped Kenya keep a focus on infrastructure development. Future prospects also include the manufacturing industry, mining industry, as Kenya is rich in mineral deposits like limestone, gypsum, or soda ash. The main exports of Kenya are agricultural, manufacturing, which includes textiles or processed foods, petroleum like fuel, oil, chemicals like detergents, and machinery that's used for agriculture or construction. The main imports of Kenya are raw materials for manufacturing, motor vehicles like aircraft or shipment parts, electronics, clothing, and energy resources like petroleum products or coal and gas. An important note to make in any of the country's economic development is the Gender Gap Index. The Global Gender Gap Index measures gender-based gaps among 4 dimensions: economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. The highest possible overall score is 1, meaning total equality between women and men. In Kenya, it was near to a closing in 2022 compared to the previous years. Index stood at 0.73, meaning that females were around 27% less likely to have the same opportunities as males. Stronger gender disparities were mostly measured in the category of political empowerment. Among the performances in sub-Saharan Africa, Kenya positioned 9th out of 36 nations. Now we'll talk about the welfare conditions and prospects within Kenya. Number 1, life expectancy. The current life expectancy for Kenya in 2022 was 67.21 years, a 0.39% increase from 2021. Life expectancy has been seen to improve from 2019 to 2022, and the standard of living increased as well. A constant increase in the expectancy rate means a continuous increase in the standard of life, since it's an increase on the national level. Number 2, infant mortality rate. Kenya's infant mortality rate in 2022 was 31.771 deaths per 1,000 live births, a 3.47% decline from 2021. The infant mortality rate for Kenya in 2019 was 35.198 deaths per 1,000 live births, a 3.14% decline from 2018. This shows that the infant mortality rate has declined for the past few years. Number 3, the literacy rate for the adult female population is 74.9%. Youth literacy rates are 85.21% and 86.59% for males and females respectively. The overall youth literacy rate is 85.9%. The youth literacy rate definition covers the population between the ages of 15 to 24 years. Number 3, hunger rate. According to a report published on 14th October 2022, one person is likely to die of hunger every 36 seconds between now and the end of the year in drought-stricken East Africa as the worst-hit areas hurtle towards famine. Oxfam warned. The international agency warned that the situation in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya is deteriorating fast. Large parts of the region have suffered 4 failed rainy seasons, with the 5th likely to unfold over the next 3 months. Climate change has decimated crops and forced pastoralists to abandon their traditional way of life. The crisis has exacerbated in many places by conflict, the fallout from COVID-19, and rising prices, partially due to the war in Ukraine. Oxfam analysis of the latest available data suggests that the rate at which people in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya are dying of hunger has increased since May, when it estimated that a person was dying every 48 seconds, and dangerous delays in providing aid to millions on the brink of starvation. Number 5, malnutrition. According to IPC Acute Food Insecurity and Acute Malnutrition Analysis, Kenya, published on September 28, 2022, about 3.5 million people are facing high levels of acute food insecurity. IPC Phase 3 or above, with about 2.7 million people in IPC Phase 3 and 7,85,000 people in IPC Phase 4 emergency. This is a 10% increase from the same period in 2021 when 2.1 million people were categorized in IPC Phase 3 and IPC Phase 4. The food insecurity is primarily driven by a combination of shocks, including a 4th successive below-average rainy season which was poorly distributed in space and short-lived, which resulted in below-average crop production, to near-crop failure and poor livestock production, localized resource-based conflict, and high food prices as a result of the war in Ukraine, and low in-country production. An important factor in a stable economy is the political situation of the country. Recently concluded general elections have set the stage for Kenya's next development chapter. The country has made significant reforms contributing towards a sustained economic growth, social development, and political stability over the past decade. However, its key developmental challenges still include poverty, inequality, youth unemployment, transparency and accountability, continued weak private sector investment, and the vulnerability of the economy to internal and external shocks. Kenya works on a governance system based on the 2010 constitution that included a bicameral legislature house. Under this system, the second election was one held in August 2022. From 2015 to 2019, Kenya's economy achieved broad-based growth average of 4.8% per year, significantly reducing poverty. However, in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic shock hit the economy hard, disrupting international trade, transport, tourism, and urban services activity. Fortunately, the agricultural sector, a cornerstone of the economy, remained resilient, helping to limit the decrease in GDP to only 0.3%. In 2021, the economy staged a strong recovery, with the economy growing at 7.5%, although some sectors, such as tourism, remained under pressure. The poverty rate has resumed its trend decline after rising earlier in the pandemic. Although the economic outlook is broadly positive, it is subject to elevated uncertainty, included through Kenya's exposure to global price impacts of the world in Ukraine. According to Transparency International Global Corruption Perception Index 2021, Kenya ranks 128th out of 180 countries. Claims of corrupt dealing, particularly in land purchases and large government contracts, persist. Other governance issues include government inefficiency and a weak regulatory judicial system. Theft, embezzlement, and fraud by public officials reduce the availability of funds for development-related activities. For instance, in December 2010, the Permanent Secretary of Ministry and Finance in testimony said that each year, corruption and mismanagement of public funds rob Kenya of cash 270 billion. This is just one example. Corruption and bad governance in Kenya therefore not only distort the availability of funds for development activities, but also directly affect development assistance partnerships by placing mistrust in the bilateral donors like US or UK. Effective development partnership expects some mutual accountability assumption. Corruption is likely to persist unless institutions like the legislature and the judiciary and the many executive institutes conduct effective investigations, helping in accountability, especially in the political domain and public sector. According to EIU Kenya, political risk assessment as of July 2022, Kenya's political risk rating remains at CC with a source of 75. The rating mainly reflects the political and security risks stemming from social inequality and corruption, as well as the disorder and disputed results in voting seasons.
An important aspect to consider in Kenya's challenges is its poverty. Despite the fact that Kenya's economy is one of the biggest and most developed in Africa, 17% of Kenya's population lives below the international poverty line, which is approximately 8.9 million Kenyans, mostly in rural regions, who are living in extreme poverty. A total of 7.8 million persons in rural areas lived on less than $1.90 per day, while 1.2 million urban residents were among the very poor. When the coronavirus pandemic caused economic disruption in Kenya in 2020, the incidence of poverty peaked. According to the data from the OPHI Country Briefing 2017, Kenya's impoverished population is severely underprivileged in terms of living standards, especially when it comes to indices for cooking, fuel, electricity, and sanitization. Additionally, the MPI percentage and poverty rates vary by location and region, like rural areas have a rate of poverty than metropolitan ones do. For instance, in Nairobi, the nation's capital, Kileleshewa's location level poverty was less than 5%, whereas Korogocho and Seba's location level poverty exceeds 60%. Given that income inequality is a factor contributing the most to social conflicts, violence and crime, which exacerbates the poverty difficulties, the distribution of wealth remains a challenge for Kenya, which in turn becomes a major contributor to poverty overall. 1/10 of Kenyans owns almost 2/5 of the nation's wealth. Despite the economy growing by 19% according to data, the wealth disparity has not closed recently. Kenya's GINI index, which the World Bank disclosed in 2015, was 40.8%, showing an unequal distribution of income. In 2005 and 2015, the annualized consumption growth jumped from 40% to a respectable 2.86% per year. This pattern is more pronounced in rural areas. This fall in inequality was supported by a number of inequality metrics, which is consistent with this pro-poor trend of economic growth. At the current pace of poverty reduction, about 1 percentage point per year, Kenya cannot eradicate poverty by 2030, says Pape, World Bank poverty economist and lead author of the Updates special section on poverty. He further also adds, accelerating the pace of poverty reduction in Kenya will require higher and more inclusive growth rates, coupled with a sharper focus on poverty reduction policies. Kenya also experienced a severe drought in October 2016. The government had declared this a national emergency. More than 2 million people were in need of food assistance. This resulted in decreased crop and livestock production, agricultural and financial losses, and higher unemployment rates. Government's assistance adds to the nation's expenditure. Such natural risks also increase the ratio of poverty and can only be balanced by preventative or solution-based measures. Thankfully, Kenya's government is said to be making significant efforts in eradicating poverty, which will require a lot of assistance from other organizations, states, aids, or economic development and employment. Recently, MPI data shows that the prevalence of poverty has been steadily declining, which gives a positive outlook for the future. Let's look at the scenario of GDP growth around and within Kenya. Kenya is an East African country with a GDP of 110.3 billion USD according to the 2021 World Bank statistics. Its GDP growth is estimated to be around 7.5% growth rate annually. In East Africa, Kenya's economy has the largest economy as compared to Tanzania's GDP growth rate of 4.6% and Ethiopia's at 5.6%. Kenya is also called the powerhouse of East Africa as it accounts for more than 40% of the region's GDP. East Africa had formed an intergovernmental organization to aid development called the East African Community EAC, which consists of 7 states, one of those which is Kenya. However, Kenya dominates as its economy links to others better in trade and investment. The coastal city of Mombasa plays an important strategic role and favors trade within Kenya and its neighbors. Although EAC member countries mostly had independence in the same period, in the 1960s, only Tanzania and Kenya escaped major internal conflict and rule. Kenya's political environment can be described as democratic, as the electoral regularity has been far better than its neighbors. The diversified economy in Kenya also encourages investors to keep an interest in its fast-growing industries, especially those that make up the Big Four agenda: food security, manufacturing, housing, and healthcare. Most of Kenya's economic development comes from the services sector, which makes up more than 2/3 of GDP growth over the past 5 years. Tourism, on the other hand, contributes a lot to foreign exchange, with almost 2 million visitors in 2018. Under Kenya's Big Four national economic agenda, the government aims to increase the productivity of the manufacturing sector such that it can contribute up to 15% of GDP in 2022. However, due to COVID, the GDP growth had fallen in Kenya to minus 0.25%. The economy recovered mostly by progress in vaccination and government's policy responses. Moreover, GDP growth rate is expected to fall at 5.7% in 2023 due to challenges in demand and supply. There has been a decline in domestic and external demand because of lower income and increase in food and fuel import costs. On the supply side, sectors face slow economic activity because of cost and push factors, which means that factors like shortages or cost increases in labor, raw materials, and capital goods can result in inflation rise, mostly in energy and food, up to 7% even. Further risk factors to the GDP growth rate can be the 2022 general election politics, increase in COVID cases, limited access to external resources, and natural factors or climate crisis. Reduction in these risks can be done by initiating educational events on elections and voting, proceeding with infrastructural reforms to build resilience against natural shocks, and countering the hesitance in public COVID-19 vaccine. The GDP growth rate of Kenya is at great risk by climate change. Drought leads to a food deficit of 20 to 30%, affecting livelihood of over 80% people and cutting down the GDP growth by 3 to 5%. Thus, adaptation policies to tackle climate catastrophe have increased, and Kenya makes nationally determined contribution (NDC) of up to 32% and places focus on achieving goals of the Climate Change Conference (COP26) by emission reduction. This can cost $64.9 billion USD from 2021 to 2030. So far, Kenya is on track to meet its sustainability targets. Hence, if Kenya continues to perform with political stability and efficient governance toward economic advancement, it is forecasted to maintain its leadership in the EAC region in terms of economics in the future to come.